Now that we have learned about the interwar economy, in this part of the chapter, which is the final part, we'll be having a look at rebuilding a world economy, means the kind of methods and the kind of measures that we took after the post-war era in order to revive the economy. The Second World War, which killed almost 60 million, ended with the dominance of two superpowers, the USA and the Soviet Union. So the Second World War that was fought between 1939 to 45, it also saw a clash of two groups of countries. Okay, here you had the Allied powers that was Britain, that was there in the First World War as well. The USA that was there in the First World War as well, and the Soviet Union that later collapsed to form Russia. All right, and in opposition to this Allied power, you had the Axis power, the other set of countries. All right, where you had Germany, okay, and you have Italy. Italy changed its group, and then you had Japan. All right, so the Allied powers were fighting against the Axis power, and of course the Allied power won, and via the defeat of Germany and Japan. Okay, so it again saw a vast destruction of life, a vast destruction of a lot of families, okay, and economy, no doubt economy, and also it led to another depression, okay, that of course it led to an economic depression, but this depression was mostly related to the horrendous regimes that had been carried out, especially by Germany. All right, in relation to the Jews, the anti-Semitism, the concentration camps, okay, and the chemical agents that were being used more, you can say, on a massive scale. Approximately, you can say that it was there in use doubly than that was there in the use in the First World War. All right, so you can see here that how the massive destruction of the Second World War, it resulted in a huge loss of life, in an economic depression, and it also led to an increase in the post war syndrome, the post war depression. Okay, and because of the discrimination of the Jews by the Germans, the kind of treatment that they were being subjected to in the concentration camps, the kind of chemical agents that they were exposed to, the different regimes in which they were killed, the strategic measures that were taken by the Germans, and basically all of the countries that were involved, the nuclear bombs. Don't forget about the bombs that were dropped in Japan by the USA. Okay, so all of these led to an increased amount of depression, and a huge loss of life, a huge loss of economy. Okay, so there had to be a settlement, there had to be a way by which the countries could recuperate, by which the countries could heal, not just the lives of so many people that were lost via death or via injury, but also an economic resettlement. All right, so this was done at the Bretton Woods Conference that was held by the UN, the United Nations. Okay, the United Nations in 1944 at Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, USA, with the aims of post-war international system. So they had to be all of these countries, they met and they decided that they had to be a system via which the economy could be regulated. All right, so the two of the main objectives of this was that to preserve economic stability and to ensure full employment in industrial world. So of course, all those soldiers that had gone off to war, after they came back, I told you that they were suffering from the post-war depression. So they could not just come back immediately and resort to their means of livelihood, because there was something known as the unemployment also, right? And I have been explaining you this over the course of this chapter, that how this unemployment was increased when there was an economic recession. Okay, so two forces, or you can say that two measures, important measures were being taken: the construction or the establishment rather of the IMF and the World Bank. So the IMF is you can say it is the International Monetary Fund, International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank also are also called Bretton Woods institutions. So this was being done to preserve full economic stability and to ensure that employment is reaching in all of the industrial world. So to deal with the economic surplus and economic deficits that all the countries all over the world were facing, the IMF was established, the International Monetary Fund, where countries could take loan, or where or in case of surplus products, the countries could also circulate to other countries that were in need, and the World Bank in order to regulate, in order to preserve this economic stability. All right. So the Bretton Woods system was based on a fixed economic system, on fixed exchange rate. Means whatever the kind of different countries have different currencies, right? So whatever the way in which those countries were being traded, I'm sorry, the currencies were being traded, that was done with a fixed retrospective. Okay, so there was a fixed dollar, and that was anchored with gold. You can see here that the dollar was anchored to gold at a fixed price of $35 per ounce of gold. So there was no free flow of trade. Means now, if say there was an increase in supply, or there was increase in demand, or a deficit in either of these, then this fixed system was not flexible in order to incorporate that. This was rather restrictive to a certain extent. That is why we have this, that the dollar was anchored to gold at a fixed price. So in respect of this fixed price, the British pound or the German mark or the French franc, it all regulated in adherence, in concord, or in light of this fixed exchange rate. Okay. Briefly summarize the two lessons learned by economists and politicians from the interwar economic experience. So we know that after the interwar economic experience, both of both the First World War and the Second World War, there was a huge loss of lives. There was an economic recession. There was post-war depression, and a Bretton Woods meeting or an arrangement was done by the United Nations in order to ensure that and economic stability could be reached. Okay, for the preservation of this economic stability, and to ensure that employment could be given out to unemployed people, to unemployed workers of the respective countries. All right, and two institutions were being established via in the course of this meeting. These were the IMF, or you have the full form of this, the International Monetary Fund, and also the World Bank. All right, so the International Monetary Fund was established in order to look after the surplus or the deficits in the economies of the various countries. All right, and the World Bank was there in order to ensure that this economic stability was being maintained. All right, so in order to done away with all of the economic loss that countries all over the world were experiencing, the UN established the IMF and the World Bank via this Bretton Woods meeting in New Hampshire, USA. Okay, at a convention that was held in July 1944. Okay, then the early post-war years, world trade grew annually. So when these institutions were being now set up, the world trade, it grew annually at over 8% between 1950 and 1970. So there was a certain extent to which this employment rate was increased, but still this employment rate was not so much. So the unemployment rate below 5%, it was below 5% in most industrial countries. Okay. So on an average, the employment rate was increasing. On an average, the economy was increasing, but still people had, or the countries rather, had a long way to go in order to sustain economically. Okay, incomes grew at nearly 5%, and worldwide spread of technology and multinational corporations. So all of this was done in order to preserve the economic stability, because now the countries, they had realized that after um, the World War I, there was no, you can say, rational light in annexing countries and in dominating power. Rather, it was more important for people to preserve their lives. It was more important for a country to ensure the rights of the people that it harbors, the safety of the people that it harbors, and not just safety in person, but economic stability as well. The right of all those people, in order to earn a decent income, so that they have the right to they have the access to clean water, to hygienic food, and to hygienic clothing. Okay, so a wave of decolonization and independence, it grew after the World War II. So after the World War II, when it was established that there was the supreme powers of Europe, they had also suffered huge losses, right? So now the target of these countries was not so much dependent on in order to regulate their colonies, but rather they had now become preserved in order to sustain themselves. So the England, you can understand by this logic that after the World War II, in 1945, the England was now, it was more, you can say, conserved, or it was more dedicated in order to ensure protection, safety, economic stability to its own people, rather than having a look over at its colonies. So some loose threads, they were being now developing. And of course, you have learned in the previous chapter how Indian movements, such as the civil disobedience movement, such as the Quit India movement, all of them, they had been on the run. And finally, after the World War II, when most of the countries, they realized that they had to be get rid of these economic superpowers, otherwise they would just keep on exploiting them and recruiting more of their lives to just meaningless wars. All right, so then they understood the idea of national integrity, national identity, and most colonies in Asia and Africa, they emerged as free independent nations. But they had still, they were facing with unemployment, they were still facing with poverty. So they were burdened by poverty and lack of resources. So this was the main hurdle, these were the main obstacles that is newly independent country they had to go through. Why? Because all the administration, all the important works related to economy, that were being regulated by the imperial power, by England, right? So a very you can say a very abrupt withdrawal of all these imperial logistics, that rendered the helpless, vulnerable colonized countries exposed to poverty, burdened by poverty and lack of resources. Okay, these had to be overcome. So, this led to the formation, or to rather the organization, of the newly independent countries as G77 to demand a new international economic order, or the NIEO. So, they had realized that even after decolonization, okay, even after decolonization, and even in the post-war eras, the supreme powers such as Britain, supreme powers such as the USA, such as the Russia, they were still, you know, they still had a monopoly over the important land resources, okay, over the important land resources, over the important economical system. Okay, so these newly independent countries, they realized that these powers, they were still regulating all of this even after they had been independent. Okay, so they formed an organization of themselves, and this was known as the G77, where they demanded a new international economic order. And what I mean by this is that they demanded that whatever land resources and whatever the economic resources that they have, they should be owner of that, and they should be the decider of what they should do and what they should not do, and not these supreme powers. So you can see here all these maps, all these countries in green, the South America, Africa, Saudi Arabia, India, and all of these Asian countries, okay, which were under the control of some supreme powers. They demanded they formed an organization and they demanded that they should have an exclusive right over their own land resources and over their own economic resources. Okay, then this led to the end of the Bretton Woods and the beginning of a globalization. So the fixed exchange rate system that I had told you about, where it was hindered on the gold, on the value of the gold, right, the US dollar. So now that was collapsed, that was gotten rid of, and there was a rise of floating exchange rate system. Means now the countries, the currencies that the different countries had, that were being regulated on the they were dependent on the supply and demand. Means they now they were now flexible. They were not fixed to a certain exchange rate system. They could increase their supply. They could increase their exchange rate. Okay, on how the supply and demand of a certain product is being regulated, or is being, you can say, on the go across the globe. All right. So this meant that there was a shift in the financial system, especially in the 1970s, when this fixed range system was done away with. Okay, then there was shift of operations by MNCs, means by multinational corporations, to low wage Asian countries. This means that what I mean by low wage Asian countries is that Asian countries, of course, they are not so rich, they are poor because they had to deal with the poverty and lack of resources when they were finally independent from the colonizing power. Okay, so these countries, they had massive population, and they had resources. Okay, they had certain resources that could ensure that the cost of production could be low. Okay, that the cost of production could be low. So they had all the, you can say, favorable tactics that could ensure them to have an economic stability. So they had massive population, means they had manpower, they had labor. Okay, and the cost of production means low. Cost of production was low, so means the cost of producing all those was low. So at a lower price, they could lead to a massive manufacture of products. Okay, and with the lower price and with the massive manufacture of products, these Asian countries could then enter themselves into the world economic flow. All right, to the world economic, you can say, transformation. Okay, and this was specifically made by India, China and Brazil, because India and China and Brazil are those countries where we have massive population, and there was the cost of productivity was low. Okay, India, China and Brazil. So by the shift of these powers, these countries, these Asian countries, could now make themselves prominent in the world economic transformation, and then they pave the way for their own independent economic stature. Okay, give two examples of different types of global exchanges which took place before the 17th century, choosing one example from Asia and one from the Americas. So we know that before the 17th century, in the 16th century, in the 1500s, and even before that, we had the system where cowrie shells were being used, but that was very obsolete, right? Just before the 15th century, if you remember, we had that silk trade route, right? Or rather the silk route, where if you remember that Chinese silk wagons, right? Chinese silk wagons, they were being imported from China to Europe and to other countries in the West. Okay, so this is an example where a type of a global exchange was happening. Not just Chinese silk wagons, but if you may remember, spices from India, all right, then Chinese pottery as well. Okay, spices from India, textiles, etc. So all of these materials. And if you had to choose one example from America, then if you may remember that in America, in the Americas, there was this growth of potato, there was the growth of tomatoes, of maize, all right, of groundnuts, etc. So all of these was done in the Americas, and these products, after exploration of the American land, these products were being imported from America to the European countries. So this was the example of the different type of global exchange that was there before a proper industrial revolution took place. Okay, explain how the global transfer of disease in the pre-modern world helped in the colonization of the Americas. So if you remember, the Portuguese, wait, if you remember, the Portuguese and uh, the Spanish people and the Portuguese people, they had invaded the American land via the introduction of disease known as smallpox. So I have explained you this part where I told you that the Native Americans, okay, Native Americans, they had low immunity because they were not exposed to a variety of diseases that were already prevalent in the European countries. They were used to their own methods of living, and their countries had just been explored. Their countries had just been discovered. So, of course, the kind of diseases that were prevalent in the European land, these countries these lands of Americas, they were not exposed to them. All right. So, because they had this low immunity, the Portuguese and the Spanish people, they introduced the smallpox disease so that they could render these Native Americans vulnerable, hollow, okay, from the inside, so that when they could come to conquer their lands, these people were at the lowest, okay, so that they could not pose a fight against themselves, against these people, these expeditioners, okay. And finally, this helped in the colonization of Americas, okay. Explain the effects of the following. The British government's decision to abolish the Corn Laws. So, if you may remember, the Corn Laws was that import tariff, okay, that was being levied on the corn that was being imported, so that the local British stores or the local British products could be preserved. So when the local population, they started protesting that these corn laws are very expensive and we want cheaper products for ourselves. So the government had no option but to abolish, to do away with this corn law. Okay, and when this tariff was removed, the prices got reduced. It became cheaper, and when it became cheaper, this led to various British agriculturists jobless. Okay, because those people, Britishers, they were not interested in buying their products, but rather they were interested in buying the cheaper corn. All right. So now that they had no option but to look for other jobs, they started migrating. They started migrating to America in search of job. Okay. The death of working age men in Europe due to World War. So we know that during the World War, a lot of people had been recruited to be transferred, to be commissioned to the British Army in order to fight for the Allied powers, right? So what happened that when these working age men, when they died, okay, so naturally there some people may have other men or women at home who were responsible for the economic sustainability of the family, or some people could be may not have other people who could look after their family. Are you getting what I'm saying? Means some people, some working age men could have, say, other brothers or other people who were there for the support of their family, the economic stability of their family. There are some people could have no one but themselves, and since they got died, or since they died, or since some of them they returned and they were maimed, or since some of them they were suffering from depression, that post-war depression that I was talking about. So that led to an economic recession, because those families, now they were poor or they were homeless and they could not sustain themselves in the rising, or in the rising prices, right? So this led to unemployment, this led to unrest, this led to basically an economic instability. Decision of MNCs to relocate production to Asia. So this I told you that in Asia, in Asia there is low cost of production. Okay, there is low cost of production, and plus there is a massive population. All right, so this makes possible for a variety of products to be manufactured at a lower cost, or a huge quantity of products to be manufactured at a lower cost. So this means that Asian countries, they can help themselves to be established at the world trade economic area, right? For a free world flow of for a free flow of capital, basically. All right. So this free flow of capital is happening, and it is possible via the Asian countries to be done by themselves, and they now do not need any other superimposing power. So hence this decision was done by the MNCs to relocate production power to Asian countries. Coming of rinderpest to Africa, if you may remember, rinderpest is that cattle disease that was imported from Europe, from Britain to Africa, and this was done so that the African people could be captured for the slave trade or for the plantation trade. All right, so the introduction of these cattle diseases to Africa, this rendered the livelihood of all these African native lands as vulnerable, as basically on a very grave danger. It hinged on a very grave danger, and finally the tribal people, they had no option but to be exhorted very forcefully by the Britishers for the slave and plantation trade. Great Depression on the Indian economy. We know that Great Depression had it incurred a huge loss on the Indian economy. The prices of wheat, it fell by 50%, and the prices of jute, it fell by 60%. And there was this agricultural overproduction cycle where no matter how much you produce, you could not earn because the prices were always on the decline. So this led to the Great Depression on the Indian economy. Give two examples from history to show the impact of technology on food availability. So we know that we have this refrigerated ships where livestock or where cattle can be slaughtered from its origin, from its place of origin to and the meat then could be transferred from the place of transportation. So if say that America is the place where the livestock have to be slaughtered, so they could be slaughtered in America itself, and its meat could now be transferred via these refrigerated ships to Europe, to Britain, or to other places that it has to be transported to. Okay, and the other thing is that now people had invented railway tracks. So there was railways, there was wagons, and later on cars also came on, or you can say vehicles, automobiles. So these helped, or these made possible on food products to be transported from one place to another. So if say on a farmland certain poultry or certain meat or certain other dairy products are being manufactured, and they have to be transported from one part of that city to another, so now they could be easily transported via small wagons that could ensure those items to be transported safely. Okay. What is meant by Bretton Woods Agreement? This Bretton Woods Agreement was formed by United Nations. It was formed by United Nations by a meeting that was held. This agreement was held in 1944, and where it was held in New Hampshire, USA. New Hampshire, USA. And this was done for the preservation of economic stability, okay, and for the increase in the employment rate. So this agreement, it resulted in the formation of two Bretton Woods institutions. One was the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, that regulated the surplus or any deficit in in revenues that the countries were facing, and the other institution was the World Bank, that helped in the regulation of the economic stability. All right. Now, with this, we have come to the end of the chapter, and now we'll be having a quick revision where I'll be helping you to recapitulate the important points that you had to learn in this chapter. All right, so let's get started. Here you have an events timeline where you have studied that in the 15th century, the Silk routes linked the world. All those products that were being transported from China, such as silk, such as pottery, from India, such as textiles, such as spices, and also from the Americas, the North and the South Americas, the potatoes, the tomatoes, the maize, etc. So this Silk routes linked the world, and it helped in the propagation of all these trade. Okay, then 1815 to 1846 was the Corn Laws, where the tariff was imposed on the corn laws to help preserve the British local markets. Okay, but when people started protesting that this was very, this was hindering them in order to obtain that cheaper corn, then these corn laws, they were abolished, and what then happened as a consequence, corn became cheaper, but the British agriculturalists, they had to migrate they had to migrate. Where they had to migrate? To America in order to find work. Okay, 1914 to 1918 was the World War One, and 1939 to 1945 was the World War Two, where where the whole world saw a huge loss of life, of revenue, of and economic stability. Okay, so there was this Great Depression that was the result of this war, which started from the 1929 to mid 1930s. So even though there was a production of a surplus, and the country, especially America, it was gaining economically in the 1920s, but the effects of the war, it finally caught up, and a Great Depression incurred from the 1920s to the mid 1930s. Then on July 1944, you had the Bretton Woods Conference that was held in New Hampshire, USA, where two important institutions such as the IMF and the World Bank were established in order to look after the economic stability, in order to preserve the economic stability, and in order to look after the surplus and the deficits that the countries were facing. Okay, then you have, yes, the Silk routes. I told you they are the pre-modern trade and cultural links. Why pre-modern? Because this happened before the Industrial Revolution. So before the actual advancement of technology and the actual advancement in various other arenas could take place, this kind of trade methods were adopted before that. So hence pre-modern trade and agricultural or cultural links. Europe became the center of world trade because Europe started exploring, discovering, and conquering different areas, annexing their land resources, and helping the countries in the Europe, especially Britain, become a richer economical superpower. So with the restricted overseas trade of China, means by imposing certain taxes, tariffs, and discovery of the Americas, Europe emerged as a center of world trade. Then there are three types of flow. The flow of trade means the kind of products that we have been talking about, all these resources. Okay, the flow of labor, where you had the slave trade, okay, or where you have the indentured labor. So basically all those humans, living beings that were being treated as cattle, and they were being either given no rights at all, the slave trade system, or they were being contracted, they were being impositioned on a bonded labor system. They were being contracted, but they still had no negligible, low to negligible rights, and basically no freedom at all. And flow of capital is that flow of revenue, or you can say that economical free flow. Okay, then rinderpest was that cattle plague that was imported basically from Britain, and it arrived in Africa intentionally in the late 1880s in order to weaken the African people, the tribals there, so that they could their sustainability could topple basically, and so that those Africans could then be exported to Europe, to America, for the propagation of the slave trade. All right, indentured labor was also there, but it was basically for the purpose of slave trade that this rinderpest was being introduced. Okay, the loss of cattle, it destroyed the African livelihoods. Then you have the indentured labor, and to escape this, certain Indian entrepreneurs, they migrated abroad, mainly to Caribbean islands, Mauritius and Fiji, and where we saw that cultural assimilation, the chutney music in the Trinidad and Tobago or the Guyana region, or you can say the Rastafarista religious movement of the Black Jamaicans, and you also had the Muslim festival. It's not a festival as such, it's celebrated as a festival now, but it was rather a grave cultural practice that started as a result of this indentured labor migration. Okay. Then, rise of mass production after World War I, especially via the methods of Henry Ford using his assembly line, where you had low cost of production and more massive production. All right, and if the workers used to say that we do not want to work, so he just used to increase the wages. So this method was employed to produce vehicles in a faster and a cheaper way, and it really saw the economic boom of America, especially during the 1920s. But this economic bliss was restricted because just in the 1929 to mid 1930s, Great Depression occurred. It was finally the following of the grave consequences of the World War I, and the world experienced catastrophic declines in production, employment, incomes, and trade. All right. The post-war economy was led by the dominance of the USA and the Soviet Union, but it was actually limited to an extent, because no matter how much money they could lend and no matter how much economically powerful they became, during the Great Depression, all of these actually crashed. Okay, then finally after the World War II, Bretton Woods institutions, this Bretton Woods Agreement was convened in July 1944 in the New Hampshire, USA, where two institutions were being established, the IMF and the World Bank, in order to preserve the economic stability, and plus the other agenda was to increase the rate of employment. All right. Then this new world economy, finally it recognized that the Asian countries, they could also sustain their own industrial power, and finally the collapse of the USSR brought many countries into the fold of the world economy, and also that obsolete system of a fixed exchange rate system was it was done away with, it collapsed, and then a free or a floating rather market economy that came into prevalence, where it was basically dependent on the supply and demand of products. Okay, then newly decolonized countries, they formed the G77 organization, where they asked for the economic monopoly over their land resources and other resources that could help them sustain as an economic independent country, and not to be just dependent on the economic superpowers of the Europe, especially the USA excluding Europe. So we have the USA, we have Britain and Russia from the Europe. So they were still monopolizing over a lot of institutions, and these countries, they found that loophole, they found that you can say that point, and they started then organizing themselves and found and protesting for their rights. All right. So this was all that you had to learn in this chapter, where we saw about the globalization of the world, where we saw about the different economic strategies and economic failures as well, and how the countries, how the superpowers, they learned from their failures and they helped themselves, not just themselves, but the decolonized countries as well, to basically emerge as an independent economic countries. So thank you so much for joining me here on Study Room, and I hope you keep on studying well, and take care.